A shop vac sucking up investments. That's how one Canadian industry group describes the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. That's the Biden administration's plan to build the economy of the future, and it includes massive incentives for investment in American-based production of things like renewables and high-tech. Industry on this side of the border says it puts Canada at a competitive disadvantage, but the U.S. ambassador to Canada is dismissing those concerns.
I think it would be a mistake to focus on the competitive risks to Canada or any other country as a result of the Inflation Recovery Act. There are a lot of opportunities for Canada and Canadian businesses to benefit from the incentives in the Inflation Recovery Act.
So is he right? Let's get the Canadian perspective. Kirsten Hillman is Canada's ambassador to the United States. She's in Washington. Ambassador Hillman, I'd like to start with something the U.S. ambassador just told me, that Canada doesn't really need to worry about the competitive challenges from the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that Canada always has to be vigilant when we are considering our competitive position, our integration, our investment and trade climate with the Americans, because it's very important to us. You know, it's the major economic relationship that we have. 78% of our exports go to the United States, and we're the #1 foreign direct investment location for us. So I think that we have to always be vigilant. I think that one of the things that I would say coming out of the leaders' meeting, and most specifically out of the bilateral meeting between the Prime Minister and the President, is that they both, they talked about how they are both committed to creating good, sustainable, well-paying jobs in their countries, and they're not shy about that. They talk about that very openly, and they have that in common. But they also had a meaningful conversation about how, while they're doing that, they're both committed to making sure that we work in a way that incentivizes maximum opportunities in both countries, and in particular in areas like critical minerals and semiconductors and new technologies for energy and all of the things that are going to be some of the most important industrial and manufacturing sectors of the future.
The conversation at the summit we were just at was this high-level talk, right, about strengthening continental supply chains and economic resiliency between the three countries. And you look at building this industry on semiconductors and critical minerals as sort of the industry of the future. You look at the Inflation Reduction Act, and you hear comments from people like the Canadian manufacturers and exporters who compared it to a shop vac for the U.S. to suck up capital through its incentives. So how does that sort of dynamic play in this shared economic agenda that the three leaders laid out at the summit?
Right. Well, I guess on that I would say a couple of things. First of all, Canada's in a terrific competitive position vis-a-vis the kinds of technologies and sectors that are the focus of the Inflation Reduction Act. We've been investing in green technologies and new technologies and battery technologies for quite a few years now. And the government's committed to make sure we maintain a level playing field in that investment climate that has, will be affected by the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. But the other thing that's really important to know is that there are components of it, as you know, for critical minerals, for battery technology, for vehicle assembly and manufacturing, where the Canada, US, Mexico continent is seen as domestic production for the Americans. So there's a lot in there to look at. We have to be vigilant. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but we have now from the leader directly of the United States a commitment to make sure that as they move forward in these areas, we find ways to maximize investment, production, and other activities, research and critical mineral extraction, et cetera, in our two countries and in our three countries when we were talking with the Mexicans. I think that is important. How that will play out over the next weeks and months and year, I guess, is what we will be working on. But we have a clear direction from the president that while he's focused on U.S. jobs, while he's focused on creating jobs in the United States, he's also focused on creating a strong North American partnership and Canada-US partnership.
Right, and we do have that strong North American partnership in the auto sector, as you mentioned, but we did see some challenges, right, with the electric vehicle tax credit and
Yeah.
these sorts of things that the Americans tried to do. And the pushback was possible because those supply chains exist. That integration is already there. With some of the sectors we were talking about in Mexico City, they're emerging. They're being built from scratch. So does Canada need to make sure that they get in on this early on the advanced manufacturing and processing side to ensure that there's enough on our side of the border that it sort of acts as a shield against future U.S. protectionism?
Yeah, we can and we will. And we can and we will because we have a very strong value proposition in this space. We have the resources, we have the technologies, we have the research around the technologies, we have the workforce. And we have a lot of interest from many countries to participate in this ecosystem that we have in Canada. We saw that with the German Chancellor's visit. We have South Korea who is very interested in this area. Japan is very interested in this area. And of course our dear neighbors and friends to the south are interested. So we are in a very good position to make sure that we orient the development of these new technologies and sectors in a way that is best for Canadians, while also making sure that we are working with our closest allies. We are in a moment of economic and, of course, defense and geopolitical realignment. And those two things go together. And so what we need to make sure is that while we are developing these industries, we do the best that we can for Canadians, and we also try and put ourselves in a position where Canada, the US, and Mexico are in the best competitive position in the world, which we can do because we do have the resources, technology, workforce, et cetera. And I think that that's something that the three leaders set as a goal specifically, and we'll keep moving forward there.
The resources, the technology, and the workforce, where there is a gap is on capital. And the Inflation Reduction Act makes America very attractive for capital to flow there to invest in a lot of these technologies. Canada's acknowledged it needs to respond to this. It was in the fiscal update just before Christmas that this is something that's going to be in the budget. Does a country the size of Canada have the capacity to match what the U.S. is doing, or does it need to do something more strategic and targeted to be able to compete for the money that the U.S. is very keen on?
Yeah, I think that, I don't think it's a question of doing exactly the same thing because we're not exactly the same position. We have over a dozen, for example, in the area of critical minerals, we have over a dozen minerals that the U.S. has defined as critical that they don't have within their country. We have already an ecosystem that's growing. We have programs in place that have been supporting these technologies for many, many years, whereas the U.S. is, in some respects, playing a bit of catch up there. So I think that what we want to do is capitalize on our specific value proposition and attract investment on the basis, yes, of fiscal and tax and other economic policies, but also on the basis of what we have as resources, human and otherwise, and natural, in our country. And I think that that's good for the Americans. And actually, I think that they recognize that it's good for them. And we've talked not only with the President about that, but the Secretary of Commerce and others about how this isn't a question of Canada just sending the U.S. raw materials and them doing the value added there. That's not what we're looking for, and that's not what's going to happen. And we're going to talk in really concrete ways with them about that.
Okay, I'd like to switch to one more topic if I could, and that's the situation in Haiti. We heard comments from U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in the run-up to the sit-down between the President and the Prime Minister about the desire to have a country take a lead role, not a lead-by-example role, but a lead role in the security response in that country. Did President Biden make that specific request of Canada, and do you see a scenario in the short to medium term where Canada does take this active, formal lead role on security in that country?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say that's really important to say is that we're already a lead country in responding to the crisis in Haiti. We've been sending teams of officials down there over the last number of months. We've been putting forward equipment. We've been talking to the Haitian police, but also all the different communities that are looking for support there to try and figure out what makes sense for them and what they'll be able to implement. The situation is getting a little bit better. It's not, of course, anywhere near we want it to be, but on the fundamental objective of opening up the port so that goods and energy and food and medicine can get to the Haitian people and stabilizing the security situation to allow that to happen, the President and the Prime Minister talked about that. They talked about that as the objective of the international community, of course, including Canada and the U.S. right now in Haiti. They talked about activities that we have done so far. They talked about they shared facts and information on what we're hearing and what they're hearing about the various players in the situation. And then they talked about scenario planning. Scenario planning should hopefully things get better, but also scenario planning should things get worse. That was the core of their conversation there. And the president was grateful for the work that Canada is doing already, and the U.S. government is eager to sit down with us and continue to compare notes on the facts on the ground and what we might think is appropriate, us, the United States, but other allies and friends in the region, should the situation, as I say, get worse or hopefully get better.
No, and I appreciate that Canada has certainly been helpful in the effort, shipping the armored vehicles this week and sanctioning some of the key players there, but someone needs to be in charge, seems to be what the U.S. is talking about. I mean, do you see a scenario where Canada becomes that country and is in charge of the security response?
Well, I think that this scenario assessment is a key feature of sort of understanding what the next steps would be. I think that's how I would answer your question. I think that projecting into the future, as I say, for better or for worse, that has to happen, and we will take it one step at a time.
Okay. Ambassador Hillman, thanks for your time.
All right. Thank you.